Right, good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure and honor to be in this last session with colleagues here. I'm sorry I couldn't attend before because of an urgent situation and late teaching. Um, it's a great pleasure. I'd like to thank Karim again for organizing and USG and the Institute for this very much needed conference. So I will not take too much time. You have the bios circulated. We're very happy to have as speakers, starting from my left, His Excellency Dr. George Corm, Mr. Samir Dahir, Mrs. Alia Moubayed, Dr. Sami Nader, who will all speak. So each one will have around 8 minutes as a free intervention on, the economic priorities and economic planning and policies going forward. And then I'm sure all of you will have questions and interventions. We will try to take as much as possible. It's late in the evening, but I'm sure this topic is extremely important. So if you allow me to, so we'll start with the order with Dr. Korom.
I am not a big admirer of CEDRE. I can tell it to you as an opening statement. I don't think that CEDRE will solve anything in Lebanon, except eventually making bad use of the funds that will be put in CEDRE. In addition, I'm still looking for what is the development, economic development philosophy of Lebanon. I'm searching for it. I'm looking for it. I've been writing since my young age about it. And the more we go, the more I see that we have no economic policy, no developmental policy, no climate policy, no policy to treat les ordures, to treat waste, and that there is no agreement at all inside the Lebanese political establishment on any issue. Whenever an issue is coming up, we know that the Council of Ministers will be in a state of dispute, and that things will take a lot of energy to be partially solved. And so we don't progress very fast. Maybe in 100 years we'll see, will be better, I don't know. But presently, with the present way of dealing with the issues of Lebanon, in the absence of any development view of Lebanon, and we had great examples in our history. We had the policy of Fuad Shihab, who was also a policy of decentralization. I would like to remember that Fuad Shihab had made laws for decentralization. If you read them, they're extremely good, with development council at the level of each qada and at the level of each muhafaza. And these laws are beautiful. They realize a very good decentralization that I believe we need. I believe you can not have a good citizen if the citizen has no say in what's happening in the street in which he lives, in his municipality. If he have no influence at all in his municipality, how can he has an influence at the level of the central state? And I think even education for democracy comes at the level of, at the local level. I think dealing with climate change, dealing with waste, etc., is to take place at the level of local bodies and not at the central level. So we're talking all the time about decentralization, but we never really work for it. The second point, I think that the worst thing we have made was to adopt the present monetary system. It's at the base of this inflation in the debt, having two currencies, one with very strong, the dollar, and then very weak one, the Lebanese, and shifting from the Lebanese pound to the dollar, borrowing dollars at 4%, 5%, placing it in treasury bills at 30%, 35%. This was a way to ruin the country. And our debt has been constituted by this game. I borrow in dollars, I place it in high yield T-bills. I've made the calculation that if someone has placed in 93 $1,000 in Lebanese T-bills, after 7 years he had $7,000. I don't think any stock exchange would give this type of reward. I go also to the writings of an eminent economist, which is Fred Bergstein, who said in an article that I read recently that the worst system is the system where you have a weak currency coexisting with a strong currency. He says either you adopt the currency board system, which can make sense, but you don't keep a very weak domestic currency and you put it with the dollar inside the same economy. I would add that today we don't know what is the amount of dollar banknotes in circulation in the economy. So when we have all this brilliant analysis about the monetary mass and how it evolves, we don't know how many dollars are in circulation in the economy. I find it very odd. I wish Mr. Khalil was still here. He's still here. Okay. So please take notes. Again, I would say that the best period of economic development was 1950, 1975, was where when the Lebanese pound was extremely strong and was going up all the time. And this was making, we have forgotten it, this was making our industry more competitive because the components of our industry are up to 60, 70% important from outside. So the more your currency is being revalued by market forces, the more your industry becomes competitive. But this also is out of the memories. I think we have signed like mad, like crazy people, free trade agreements, including maybe the one with the European Union, where we only ask for 10 million euro to adapt. I was asking when I was minister 700 million euro, taking into account that Tunis received 300 million and that we had 15-year wars, so that we would need more funds to restructure and reshape our industries. I would like also to remember that when I was minister, not only I had the interest rates drops from 22% to 14%, but when we had the liberation of the southern country from 22 years of Israeli occupation, I didn't ask neither for Paris 1, neither for Paris 2, or for Paris 3. We were able to do it without asking funds from abroad. Now, this has become a kind of malady, a kind of disease that we believe that without foreign funds being lent to Lebanon, we cannot function, we cannot operate. So here again, we have to make efforts to recover some logic. When we talk about the immigrant remittances, that's very nice. But let us take them net and not gross, because we have so much foreign workers here in Lebanon that in fact the number is not $7 billion, it's a pen, $3 billion in net terms. So we're very happy we have 7 billion gross. We don't look at the net figures. And that the problem today is that we have Hala in Kimashi, we have a recession, a terrible recession. I don't think we have seen such a recession. all the indicators are awful. If you look at the number of cars sold, it's 20% or 25% down. If you look at registration of properties in the cadastre, it's also 18% less. If you look at the checks that are being sent back because there is no provision, الشيكات المرتجعة, something absolutely frightening. And I am flabbergasted that in the previous meeting, nobody talked about the recession in Lebanon. As if tout va très bien, Madame la Marquise, let us just have CEDRE and we'll be in paradise. I'm sorry for my colleagues, but there is something naive about it. Because what is happening nowadays, this recession is so deep that we should concentrate on how to get out of the recession and not on how we get out more funds and borrow more funds from CEDRE. In addition, I haven't seen any, if you like, developmental view of Lebanon in the CEDRE project. What I see, as much as I can read, contractors, which will make fantastic money. But the development of the country, are these really the project we need? What on what studies are we based? I've seen the McKinsey report. My God, do I need 1,000 pages to describe Lebanon? C'est pas sérieux. You don't need 1,000 pages to describe Lebanon. Really, you don't need it. And to say things that, the bon sens, of course, I mean, common sense, but you don't need to pay $1.5 million to get a 1,000-page report. As we mentioned, we forget, sometimes when I see the words of the billions of dollars in Lebanon, I think, my God, I must be a country of 200,000 square kilometers. I must have 50 million inhabitants. And I will remind you, maybe I will conclude with this, that after the war, Bechtel came, made a report, who was certainly inflated, but what was the figure of reconstructing Lebanon with the Bechtel report? It was $3 billion. Okay. Then Mr. Hariri came. This was put aside. We had Horizon 2000, $18 billion. Okay. So $18 billion, and then we go for playing between the Lebanese pound and between the dollar. The result is under our eyes. I'm sorry to say, I'd like to be optimistic, but I really don't believe that CEDRE is going to be in any way a solution. As long as we will not have a developmental view of Lebanon, a view also about climate, what to do about climate, because we are in a country where the rate of cancers is extremely high. And when you see the health bill in Lebanon, it's absolutely awful. And I'm sure that the cancer rate is linked to the deterioration of our environment and our climate. So I believe we should make a big effort to have people focused on the real issues and not on issues that are not pertinent in the present situation of Lebanon. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll hear from Mr. Samir, who's an economist, but also a former advisor to the Prime Minister. So again,
to the former Prime
Minister.
Advisor to the former Prime Minister.
The theme of my intervention is to say that in Lebanon we have an outdated economic model and it needs to change. And I want to talk about the lethal effects of all our public policies on the real economy. The review of the key parameters of Lebanon economy shows that the model that may have served it well for a time is now out of breath. The outcome has been anemic growth, rampant unemployment, widening income gap, rising poverty, loss of human talent to expatriation, obsolete infrastructure, and widespread natural destruction. This model can no longer meet the expectation and vital needs of a stable and prosperous society. Through its contemporary history, Lebanon's economic performance has been marked by fragility and the impact of conflict. The 1975 civil war wrought uncounted losses in human capital by death and immigration, especially of youth. Immeasurable erosion of physical capital, infrastructure, housing stock, and productive assets, and especially the marginalization of state institutions from which Lebanon is yet to recover. The challenge for Lebanon today, with its so-called legendary resilience, is to erase the legacy of the civil war, restore a working institutional order, and avoid the pitfalls of regional conflict. It also needs to achieve strong and sustained growth rate that create high value-added jobs on a scale sufficient to maintain civil peace, reduce social and regional inequalities, and spare young professionals the inexorable fate of exile. Only job creation could slow down immigration from Lebanon, a nation that has turned into a factory outshipping talents and skills. Good jobs result only from productive and innovative investment, which at the scale required, about 20,000 new jobs a year, can only be justified by the access to a market extending well below the narrow confines of the national territory of 4 million Lebanese residents. Exports pertain not only to agriculture and manufacture projects, but also should increasingly involve the provision of knowledge-based services in information technology, engineering, consulting, research and development, accounting and auditing, publishing, media, and medical tourism. Yet, the ability to export goods and services rests heavily on the competitive power of the economy. Now, what about this competitiveness in Lebanon? In the World Bank 2018 Doing Business Assessment, which measures factors influencing competitiveness, Lebanon ranks 133rd out of 190 countries, underperforming Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and the MENA regional average. That's hardly surprising, as the competitiveness of the Lebanese economy is assailed on all fronts by high interest rate, an unsupportive fiscal framework, a decaying infrastructure, dysfunctional institutional setting with entrenched corruption, and exodus of talent. Further, in the absence of sizable and continuous productivity gains, the fixed nominal exchange rate parity and its attendant cost add significantly to the rigidity of the existing economic model, with the real effective exchange rate naturally creating a bias for import against export. Thus, in 2017, Lebanon import stood at about $23 billion compared to a paltry $2.3 billion in export. That is a trade deficit of some $20 billion, nearly 40% of GDP. Now, what is then needed are radical adjustment in the 5 following areas. First, the access to credit, the high interest rate. Lebanon high interest rate put upward pressure on corporate borrowings and thus domestic production costs, further eroding competitiveness. Even at a time of historically low global interest rate, nearing zero in some countries, Lebanon's dire fiscal situation, the result of unbridled government spending over 15 years in the absence of budget law, has been driving up the cost of credit. Indeed, the high base rate that Lebanese commercial bank must offer to attract the external flows necessary to finance ever-increasing public deficit and debt, and massive trade imbalances are transmitted throughout the economic cycle. Lending for productive investment becomes crowded out, as it was said, as a result of the high cost of money and the significant portion of bank resources that are diverted both to the treasury debt market and to central bank instrument funding the foreign currency reserve needed to support the exchange rate peg that has been the anchor of monetary policy for a quarter of a century. No less worrisome regarding indebtedness is that the scourge of the public debt no longer appears on the radar screen of a nation accustomed to this debilitating disease, though its latent effect will in time consume the body. Not even debate about its solution seems to be tolerated. After the Minister of Finance recently spoke about restructuring or rescheduling debt, he had to suffer the walk to Canossa. Number two, there is an unsupportive fiscal framework. In Lebanon, ad hoc adjustment to the tax regime sporadically appear in the frame of budget laws, that is when we issue budget laws, with the sole objective of raising revenue. They are enacted without assessing their impact on investment, on consumption, on savings, on employment, on productivity, on export, on home ownership and land use, or their social repercussion, of course. Tax reform to succeed must be dissociated from budget cycles and imperatives, and drawn in consultation with main stakeholders, trade union, employers associations, sectoral groups, political party think tanks, in conjunction, where possible, with measures aimed at improving public services, which would make increases in levies and tariffs more acceptable and legitimate. Otherwise, fiscal reform becomes hostage to political conflict and social strife. Fiscal regime and public debt are critical levels of public policy. They deserve the utmost seriousness and effort, which unfortunately both seem wanting. Number three, the decaying infrastructure. The lack of capital investment in infrastructure, barely 10% of total public expenditure, less than 3% of GDP, over 4 decades has taken its toll on the provision of essential public services as a result of deficient capacity and uneven and costly access to services, unreliable electricity supply, congested road, inadequate water and sanitation network, expensive and inefficient telecommunications system weigh heavily on the productivity of all economic agents. Moreover, soaring land value and therefore high factory and office space cost, the result of scarcity certainly, but also of a misaligned tax regime as previously a speaker spoke of, add measurably to enterprises' operating cost. Number four, we have a dysfunctional institutional order, an outdated, obstructive, and cumbersome administration, and systemic corruption amounting now to state capture represent strong headwinds to the system efficiency as a whole. A ruinous code of conduct and questionable ethics pervade economic management and impede the overdue reforms of government practices in state institutions, overstaffed and underperforming and subservient to political interest. And lastly, number five, a depleted talent pool. The loss of talent to immigration affects the economy in a dramatic and lasting way. This is for the people. This is for the youth under 35. And dense Lebanon potential in develop is knowledge-based economy. Structural, fiscal, legal, regulatory, and governance reform are needed to retain at home Lebanon diversified pool of talent. The only way to spur the budding knowledge-based industry. With the proper incentive, this growing sector could leverage abundant fiscal financial resources. We have $180 billion in the banking system. So there are plenty of resources there. We don't need to go and borrow $11 billion, in order to, to do the development we need. With the proper incentive, this growing sector could leverage abundant financial resources and the privileged geographic location to market its input across a regional and possibly global consumer base. This is, of course, in addition to the traditional sector of banking, trade, tourism, and selected manufacturing, where Lebanon's position is well established, though it's increasingly challenged. Yet, current public policy, to the contrary, favors the expatriation of a Lebanese skill. This goes with the golden eggs that perpetuates the infernal cycle of immigration that generates the remittances needed to finance the twin budget and current account deficits. In conclusion, for the Lebanese economy, salvation may only come from growth through productive and innovative investment in competitive, export-oriented activity, creating high value-added jobs, which can retain at home a substantially larger share of Lebanese of Lebanon's youth and pool of talent. Now, all cannot be retained, but all shouldn't be forced into exile either. Such a regime to materialize requires radical public policy changes, essentially a reversal of these lethal practices in the 5 areas I've listed. This reform would also help Lebanon expand its domestic production and import substitution activities, where it has a comparative advantage. Now, we keep talking about reforms. For me, the days of reform have elapsed. Now the time is for adjustment. And that is the only road through which the Lebanese miracle might be given a new lease of life. Thank you.
Now we move to Ms. Alia Moubayed, who's a school alumni, remember, and also a chief economist right now at Jefferies and in MENA managing director. You can have 10 minutes and more.
Thank you very much. I mean, first I would like to thank my my dear friend Karim, who dragged me for the invitation and for dragging me again to join yet another really interesting discussion about Lebanon's intractable economic woes, and together with many of you with whom we have been working for many years to come now, many years and hopefully to come. But I was particularly interested, frankly, to participate in this is because I think this session is exactly tackling the question that Dr. Corm rightly put, and that I'm sure many of the Lebanese are asking themselves too, whether they live here or whether they live abroad like myself, or anybody who's like analyzing Lebanon for many different reasons, whether for intelligence purpose, for geopolitical analysis, or for investment, potential investment. And that is the question of, is there an economic policy in Lebanon? And if yes, who is responsible for it? Actually, for anybody who is looking from outside, again, I consider myself an insider, having worked for a long time in the Lebanese administration. But I am also privileged now to look at it from outside. And I can just tell you how the outside world is looking at us and at our economic policy framework in Lebanon. Having worked myself in the 1990s and the 2000s with Dr. Corm and Dr. Saidi, Youssef, and many of you, I can just say, frankly, and to be blunt, because I think we cannot afford not to be blunt anymore, is that I have yet to witness such a dire state of economic policy and weakness in the institutions in charge of economic policy in Lebanon. I am heartened to say this because this is how it looks from outside. A fragmented policy-making process, competing economic decision-making centers, poor policy coordination, and erosion of institutional capacity of policy analysis and formulation in the economic field, and the lack of basic tool, policy evaluation and accountability, and that is statistics. And if we are to talk about the need to have credible policies, because credible policies are essentials for citizens to believe in the continuity of the state and of the need to contribute to it so that they receive the service, or for credibility of policies for those who are funding us, whether they are creditors internally or externally, I think it is important to ask ourselves a few questions, and I'll try to address them. The first one is the diagnostic right that this government and now that we're dealing with, whether it's part of the McKinsey report or of the CEDRE background, are we talking, is this the right diagnostic for our problem? And I think that was the question of Tariq a little bit earlier. Of course, I don't have the time to go into that, but I think, fine, yes, I agree with many of you who said that the McKinsey report is a positive contribution as an analytical exercise that provides us, at least that provides a new generation of young people who are here and who are not accustomed to these things. But I can tell you, having been there for the past 20 years involved in these things, that we did the same in the 80s with Monitor. We did the same with the World Bank, with Booz Allen, with the IMF. And actually, if we are only to look at some of those recent, because we might say, oh yeah, but things have changed. Let us look at some of the two latest reports of the World Bank, which looked at what are the key constraints, and we call it the Rodrick Houseman growth constraints diagnostic, to understand what is it that that is preventing our growth and our job creation from being inclusive. And this is why I think what the McKinsey report and what CEDRE tell us what we already know. Or basically, and maybe, and I will argue later on, that actually it's not only déjà vu, but it's also incomplete. And it is incomplete in the most important element that constitutes the constraints to our growth and development. The two reports of the World Bank, based on the Rodrick Houseman diagnostic framework, has, and I quote, has identified constraints affecting Lebanon's potential to deliver sustained and high growth, economic growth, include huge macroeconomic imbalances, weak business environment, insufficient investment in infrastructures, skills mismatch with labor market needs, and weak institutions and regulatory framework. All what we find in the McKinsey and in the CEDRE approach. But yet, what these reports and what this approach to policymaking over the last couple of years has ignored is really what we call the elephant in the room. And what the World Bank in its has called in its 2015 report, based on many of the work of people here in this room, is what we call elite capture. Elite capture that is institutionalized by the confessional system in which all the other constraints that I just mentioned are nested and meshed. And that is the overarching constraint that, again, quoting the World Bank report, has been at the root of Lebanon's failure to generate inclusive growth and jobs. These are the illegal activities that are not sanctioned by the state when involving politically, confessionally connected and or wealthy actors, exacerbating elite capture and the pervasive patronage system that we have. What one of our international interlocutor closely associated with the SAD recently in one of my visits as bringing some clients here told me, grand scale corruption. But today in the literature of corruption, we don't call it corruption, we call it state capture. And state capture is really what is missing in this diagnostic. And the reason why we should attach more importance to it, because experience around transition economies who have grappled with very high levels of poor governance or corruption actually shows that the outcomes are at best basically being trapped in a very low level equilibrium, one of poor quality growth and a very low, very low, if none at all, value added creating jobs. So failure to address this in the diagnostic, in calling a spade, and saying that it is this system that, if not addressed properly, can continue, then any of our attempt to move ahead with the prescriptions of CEDRE and the CEDRE framework eventually will lead to more accumulation of that. And maybe here I beg to disagree with those who argue that yes, we should look at the denominators. Of course, we should look at the denominator and at the growth impulse from higher public investment. But I would agree that that would be the case if we were not really this pot that is all full of holes, as Dr. Khalil called it. But we are unfortunately in this situation, and unless we get these holes filled first and addressed before we put in more money, then the only potential outcome is higher debt, so higher numerator, and very slow improvement in the denominator, and therefore a continued vicious cycle of higher debt, lower growth, and more debt unsustainability. And the reason why I say this is basically not that we cannot address that, but I'm just calling that as we prioritize policies, because from here now, I mean, when we see all these thousands of pages and 115 pages of recommendation, the key is how do we sequence and prioritize reforms? Because obviously we all know that we have limited capacity. We talked about the low productivity public sector, despite the very bright minds that we still have there and which we and whom we salute. But it is a fact that we have to focus on those reforms that get the largest dividend. And here again, I get back to the prioritization done in the 2015 and the 2013 papers of the Growth Diagnostic. And those two key areas are the addressing the fiscal imbalance, because it is the major drag on growth and on our current account, and therefore causing this continued appreciation in our exchange rate that cannot basically square with our wish to have better and more competitive industries. And second, of course, and in line with the combating of the state capture, our focus should be on increasing the contestable and competitive markets. And I mean, I'm not going to go through what we can do on the fiscal front. I think by now we all know what needs to be done, and that this remains an urgent issue. But I'm just saying that we cannot also put the cart in front of the horse. We cannot start borrowing, as this government in its first Council of Ministers decision has approved 11 new loans without really telling the population and the donors and the investors that are lending us money what is our fiscal policy. Today, there is no fiscal policy in Lebanon, not only for 2019, but we also don't have a medium-term fiscal framework. Actually, as observers of the latest numbers in the government, that in 2018, we have actually decredibilized our fiscal framework by saying in 2018 that we will commit to an 8% deficit, and then we end up with 11.2% of fiscal deficit. That in itself, as Dr. Saidi said, erodes both the credibility of any policy and also of the policymakers who want to try and convince whether the Lebanese or the creditors in the future that no, in 2019 we will be able to reduce the deficit back to 9%. So today, this erosion of confidence in our ability to stick to our targets is causing our own problem. And this is why I think one of the key things we can do in the short term to focus on the short term is to create this medium-term fiscal narrative. Put our policies in a 4-year program, clearly delineated, and stop focusing on how much money are we going to get from CEDRE. This is the wrong question to ask, because at the end of the day, whoever is going to be lending us, instead of lending us at 5%, not seeing where we're going in 4 years, is going to normally ask us to borrow at 11 and at 12 and at 13%, adding to this vicious cycle that I just heard. So addressing the fiscal imbalances through the range of revenue and expenditure measures of reducing the wage bill and restructuring the benefit, the ODL subsidy, rethinking and how do we want to restructure our debt potentially, asset monetization and asset sales of government, while looking also on the revenue side, how we can get our tax system more inclusive and equitable. These are the key issues that we need to see both as citizens and as creditors in a 4-year medium fiscal framework. I understand the World Bank is helping the government on doing that, and I hope that we can see this sooner and later, because without this medium-term fiscal framework, the only thing we are hearing about is more debt and higher spending, and that is in itself just a driver for further capital flight and therefore a weakening of our reserve position. On the combating of the state capture, there are actual immediate things that we can do. These start, as somebody said today, and you asked a question about judicial reform. I think the civil society, and I know Kulluna Irada as one of those actors in this field, along with the with Parliament, has put at its priority the importance of the judicial independence law. Because, of course, how can you combat state capture, i.e. the ability of politicians to capture the state and use its resources to their end if we do not have an independent judiciary like we have in many other countries? So that should be our first and foremost, utmost priority. Measures to foster political accountability, whether as enforcing asset declaration and conflict of interest rules, is the way to combat state capture. Transparency in public procurement, and I know that the Institute of Finance is doing fantastic work on preparing the public procurement, a modern and transparent public procurement law. This is what we should be putting on the table before borrowing any $1 from any creditor. I think this is what we should be holding our politicians accountable in order to put this sequence of policies right and go into a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, Dr. Sami Nader, the floor is yours.
The hard thing when you are the last to talk is everything is said. But the nice thing that you can be very short because people are in a hurry. First, thank you for the organizers. Thank you, EMIL Foundation. It was great emotion that I recall. My friend Elias Moukheiber, I know here in these premises, and this was great emotion that I recall his memory. Thank you, Karim, for putting so much energy in this and linking the university with the city, which is a great thing that you're doing. So I have like 3 sets of remarks. The first set is the priorities. What are the priorities? Because we're here to talk about reform. This is the major building block of CEDRE. This is why I'm with CEDRE, and I consider this is our last chance. I don't think that CEDRE is the only way, but CEDRE may be the last chance because we're running against, a tough general, which is general time, and we don't have time anymore. And if we don't see this opportunity, all the international momentum that is gathered to implement this reform, I think that we're heading to a collapse, to put things very frankly. This is the only reason why I'm supporting CEDRE. Is there any other ways? Definitely there are other ways to do it. We would have been better off with having an investment fund and attracting investment instead of getting more loans and more debt. But this is not the case, and because this is the only way to push for reforms, I think this is why we have to put all the efforts in order to push for this reform. So the first set of remarks is, what are our priorities? It boils down to one thing: reducing public expenditures. We cannot sustain a 7.5 billion in terms of budget deficit. We're making 54 billion in terms of GDP. It's more than 11% of our GDP. This has to stop. This is not sustainable. And if they keep on the same path, we're heading to 14% budget deficit next year, and this is unsustainable by all means. So, putting first things first, reducing public deficit. Yes, we need a host of reforms. Yes, we need to review our health coverage system. Yes, we do need to review our pension plan. Yes, we need to boost SMEs. But there is an urgency today is to reduce public expenditures. And this where CEDRE is of essence. Because they took a commitment to reduce the budget deficit by 1% every year, and they have to be accountable for that. And if they don't do that, they are breaching the law, because الموازنة is a law. And we have to keep them accountable for that. So this is the second elephant in the room. Yusuf talked about it, is the budget, the deficit in the balance of payment, the current account deficit. We are in this situation, the weird situation, for the 8th year in a row where we have this twin deficit. Budget deficit and the current account deficit. This is not sustainable no more. This is stifling the economy. This is putting a lot of pressure on the interest rate. Yes, we have a monetary stability, but at what price? The interest rates are skyrocketing, and they are putting businesses, small businesses and big businesses today out of business. It's not only in the real estate, but all the small businesses now, they cannot afford paying their invoices to the banks, their dues to the banks, because the interest rates are keeping increasing. So against this background comes CEDRE and McKinsey. The good thing about CEDRE, once more, is because it's linking financial package to reform. The best case scenario is getting the reform and keeping them the loans. We don't need their money. We want them to help us achieving these reforms. The worst case scenario is having the loans without the reform. This is what some political parties are trying to do. It recalls me this saying in Arabic, بلنا بالقروض لإصلاحاته راحوا الإصلاحات وبقوا القروض لحالهم. And this is the worst case scenario, is to have more debt without the debt. But I'm not seeing CEDRE really being implemented, because I'm seeing a lack of consensus of the CEDRE. I was hoping that when they did this taswiyah, this compromise to come up with this government, that they felt the heat, and now they said, this is our last chance, let's save the boat. It doesn't seem to be the case. And my view is that these reforms, if they are implemented, they will transform the political economy. It means that they will transform the political system. And this is something, and they will transform the system that is generating them, and this is the impossibility. The McKinsey. I think the McKinsey is a good way to fix this balance of payment thing, because it's export-oriented. Yes, it doesn't offer a vision. Yes, it's totally, it skipped the social dimension. This is for sure, but it has the advantage to help shaping the competitive edge in Lebanon, to help boosting the export, to help attracting foreign currency. It means to help fixing the problem of the current account. This is the only positive and the big positive thing about McKinsey. However, as Nader said at the beginning, today McKinsey is orphan. There is no champion in the government to drive the McKinsey plan. At least this is my view. My third set of remark is the implementers, whether it's CEDRE or McKinsey. Who is the implementers? We need a new operating system. The old operating system doesn't work. They cannot be the implementer neither of CEDRE nor of McKinsey. I mean, these McKinsey and there are beautiful applications like Google Map. You cannot download them on your old telephone that you used to have at your grandparents' place. This doesn't work. Because their aim, if the reforms are made, they will transform the operating system. So the old system cannot generate the new system. So the alternative. I fully agree with you that the priority, you cannot have this implemented if you don't reform the judiciary system. Second, a new electoral law. A new electoral law that will produce an opposition. Why an opposition? Because you need it in the economic side. You need opposition to provide the check and balances. There is no fighting corruption without a proper opposition and proper check and balances system. So, waiting for a new electoral law, waiting for a reform of the judiciary, yes, it's important to have gathering like this in order to play the part of the opposition. And I think this is the role of a civil society today. I will stop it here.
Thank you very much. Before opening the floor for comments and quick questions, I'd like to make a very short, abuse my 1 minute as a chair. I think CEDRE and McKinsey came in an election year where they were the result of the entente, of the agreement between Hariri and Aoun, which technically replaced the troika of Hrawi, Hariri, and Berri with a new troika. And we're seeing the results of this troika, of this system, of this capture through this. CEDRE was presented as a set of reforms to have public support, for international support. These reforms were dating, and most of you know, since Paris 1. So very old reforms. They just rehashed them and put them. The objective of CEDRE is to support Saad al-Hariri very clearly, and it was implemented in the Prime Minister's office, with Prime Minister Office staff. The own movement back then, election year, so that Hariri was getting international support to get and winning an election with promises. Let's say things the way they are. Decided to bring in consultants for $1.2 million that we paid as taxpayers for rehashing basically a report, and they called it their own reforms by the Ministry of Economy and Trade. So what we're now discussing as government policy are the outcomes of electoral programs that are basically rehashing some results. What is unfortunate is that when we used to work in the public sector and close to the public sector and in agencies, the international community was more detached. It was more detached, was more critical of the system of, muzayadat, of thinking, I will do this plan and I will do this plan, and in the end, no plan is done. So if we think really like us as citizens, taxpayers, parents, students, what do we need? We just need better infrastructure, not more jobs, and better jobs, and we just need very low corruption. Corruption exists everywhere. We just need them to take some money, but very, very low. The end result is that we don't have a private economy, we don't have a private sector-driven economy, and we don't have a pure socialist economy where the government spends on all sectors. We have a hybrid system disguised by private interests and private personal leaders' interests. And I will end with only one thing about the governance, and this is something I haven't seen since I came back to this country. The decision-making within government and in parliament is no longer there. You hear ministers, parliamentarians, leaders saying, we came to the meeting of the Council of Ministers, we didn't know this was on the table. We haven't read this procurement document. We don't know anything. So my question for everybody, who knows? Somebody knows, somebody's passing the deals, and we can easily think that all of these reports and conclusions very good, but unless things realize that they need to change for our own interest, elections definitely opposition. But right now the boat is sinking, yes, but somebody is making these deals, and they have to realize that they can throw on us international support and reports and whatever without changing this internal governance. In Ta'if Accord, the Council of Ministers decides unanimously. You were a minister, The Council of Ministers decides. You were a minister. Even the Taif Accord is not respected. There are talks that the electricity deals, all of the big procurement, even under CEDRE, will go to many ministerial committees that they will decide on behalf of the Council of Ministers. This is unprecedented. What Gibran Bassil and Saad al-Hariri are doing to the Council of Ministers with Hezbollah and Birri in the back is a legitimized power grab on what remains of the government. And I hope that the international community, the World Bank, are vigilant to this and don't dance along with this tune. Based on this, we open the floor for comments. I hope you stick to 2 minutes if you can, very quickly. If you have a specific question to a specific speaker, please mention her or him by name. And if you can...
Patrick Atme, I'm a financial consultant. So thank you again. And I have actually 2 questions. The first question is addressed to Dr. Corm. Dr. Corm, you've talked about like development policy in this country, the need for a development policy. Do you have any idea, I mean, what type of development policy should be applied in Lebanon? Is there any model that we can follow today in Lebanon? And is there any hope of change? I mean, if the right model is applied in Lebanon? This is the first part. The second part is addressed to Ms. Alia Moubayed. We've talked a lot about reforms. Is there any clear and transparent mechanism for the implementation of these reforms? I mean, we've been hearing about reforms for like decades. So basically, how can we be sure that these reforms would be implemented and will lead to effective results? Thank you very much.
1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. Nasser Isa, ex-chairman and CEO of the CAT Group. As a follow-up to Dr. Corm's negative opinion of CEDRE, there is a plausible theory that the main incentive behind the World Bank and Europe in supporting CEDRE is to bring opportunities, to create opportunities for Syrian refugees and laborers and to stop them from going to Europe. I'd like to know your opinion about that. Secondly, under the existing governing parties, do you think there is any possibility for for the redemption of the economic situation in Lebanon? Any chance of redemption for the economic situation in Lebanon? Thank you.
Answer in 5
Yeah, Engineer Sanati again. It seems to me that the logic of Dr. Sami Nader is the best. You know, we are with CEDRE because of this. We are. What have been taken to bring privatization or the ease of doing business instead of being 133 in 190 our rank in competitiveness? Why we don't put pressure on our deputies that one of the way out of this mess is to open competition. We see oligopoly all around. We see people are gaining 50% because there is under the table agreements. We see lots of even it has to do with the duties and coverage of other things, you know, because they are manufactured in Lebanon. We see that in the medication. We see so just taking that steps. I believe that will be 3% growth rate, and we won't have that much problem. Without $11 billion of CEDRE, we can take only 3 or 4 for the highways and for the port and for the airport. That's all.
I like the diagnostic, in particular the idea of state capture. But it's also not only state capture; it's regulatory capture. Yeah, particularly insofar as the banking system is concerned. My question is the following: what you need is not only addressing the flow deficit, i.e. fiscal sustainability, it's also addressing debt sustainability. And whatever you do on the flow side is not going to be enough given the level of debt that you're going to do. And whatever you do on the debt side is not going to be sufficient unless you address the flow deficit. So my question is really the following. If we look at countries which have the twin deficits we've talked about, current account deficits and budget deficits, they are the most vulnerable to financial crises. Financial crises lead to social crises, economic crises, and then eventually political crises. So it seems to me Lebanon is now at a crossroads where either you will get some internal reforms, and maybe CEDRE can be an input into getting internal reforms, or it will be more expensive and hurt more if the reforms are imposed from the outside through the capital markets. This idea, this illusion that we have that we own most of the debt, that's all for Lebanese, does not mean that you're not going to have a crisis. The numbers, of course, are staggering. 1% owns 50% of the deposits. 0.1% owns 35% of the deposits. So if they decide that they're going to withdraw because you don't have any credible fiscal policy, you don't have a credible economic policy or a macro policy, then you get a crisis on your hands. And so I think the choice right now is either you reform or it's going to be imposed on you. And if it gets imposed from you from the outside, the results are going to be expensive. It will be a long drawn out recession, maybe for a decade. So I think the message needs to come out. My question again is I don't see the reformers, unfortunately. The message from 2018, elections, civil society, and all the rest, somehow that message did not come through to the politicians. They are still there, they're playing their same games, and I'd like to see who the reformers would be that can implement and even suggest a few reforms before they are imposed on us by the markets.
Quick answers. So first, Dr. Corm, you had a question about what is the ideal development policy, and is there any link between CEDRE and the Syrian refugee crisis?
Should take into consideration that we have many extremely underdeveloped regions in Lebanon. And it's flabbergasting to see that these poverty pockets, I think of Akkar and Dinniye especially, and in the Bekaa Valley also, are the same that were in the time of President Fuad Shihab and Bi'asat Irfad. I mean, there is something wrong about it. I know the World Bank has this good idea of social safety nets, okay? But the social safety nets would not make Akkar to flourish, for instance. It's a good idea for the poor strata of the population. Also, I'm afraid also that then you will create the status of the poor, the social safety net, that you put the poor on a status of being poor. I think what should be done, and we had good results with the Economic and Social Fund, was the very small loans, was the community development. I think we should have much more than this. Because if we keep the poor in the status of poor, I think this is quite negative for a country. On the contrary, the poor has to get out. And for the poor to get out, you need to have a vibrant economy who creates employment. And I think creating employment is what we need, because we have, in fact, a reverse transfer of technology when we are sending our best brains abroad, and we're very happy to cash the remittances, which are just peanuts compared to what the Lebanese families have been spending to raise their children and give them high capacity. So we are subsidizing the recipient country's economy, and it's a losing operation. I think this needs to be more elaborate, to have the Lebanese understand that this is not a good operation to export brains. While we have so many capacities in Lebanon, we have water, we have good agricultural land, our young people who remain at home are excellent at ICT and very gifted. So there is no reason for us to send brains abroad if we developed another development model.
Perfect, thank you. Alia, if you can comment on the question on the clear mechanisms for, are there clear mechanisms for reform? And then back to Said's question about this mismatch.
I mean, on the reform thing, it's obvious that, I mean, I think if I'm partly raising my concerns about CEDRE, it's because I believe that the CEDRE undermines the policy-making process. And in any normal administration, reforms should be part of the business plan and of the day-to-day job of every single ministry. So you have to have overarching policies, and then every ministry in its sector, and where you have cross-sectoral reforms, and these are done through interministerial committee, and there is usually some form of, I mean, in countries that have done that, you have the Secretariat General of the Council of Ministers, who is actually creating a mechanism of monitoring and reporting and benchmarking reform progress. I mean, ideally, this is how we want to do it. It doesn't make sense just to wait when the Prime Minister is going to say on Twitter that we signed this law or we did this to kick the box and let everybody know. There should be institutionalized ways of saying this is a policy, this is a tool, and this is what we've done, and this is what remains to be done. And I think for CEDRE too, if I want to go in the line of what Sami was saying, to really deliver on being a catalyst and a good framework for doing it ourselves, as Dr. Saidi is suggesting it could be better, then you really need to have a narrative, and you need an accountability and a mechanisms for monitoring and for a monitoring result of the implementation of this reform. Because what we have so far is passing laws, and we heard Mr. Yassin Jaber, who is, and many MPs complaining themselves as members of parliament that they cannot even hold accountable governments and the executive on the implementation of those laws. So that's it is not an easy things. But going back to institutions is the only way to make sure you have mechanisms in place. And maybe one good thing is really the competition. I mean, competition law. You pass the law. You have a competition authority. You publish reports, you create statistics for pricing, in particular sectors where you're introducing, let's say, more liberalization, etc. There are many ways to do it. I mean, I agree with Dr. Saidi. I think this is the dilemma we are facing, is that can we have the credibility of doing ourselves our reform and convince both our domestic basically stakeholders, but also our external partners that we are serious in doing it, and that we are doing it to have it in a sustainable way, i.e. addressing both the flow and the stock problem, or we are going just to do just what is right to keep ourselves from the financial crisis that you talked about. And I think, frankly, I mean, if you look at the logic of CEDRE, or the logic of the McKinsey report, it's doing those reforms that are probably the easier one, while waiting for some kind of external windfalls, either through the reconstruction of Syria or through, and it's a big part, or of oil, but. And I think this is the risk that we are running, that we do just enough reforms in the next 2 years to avoid the financial crisis, while waiting for external drivers that could transform the dynamics of the flow and of the stock. So that would be a big miss.
Refugee thing, we all missed it in the panels. I write it down, but I did not speak about it. Let's be clear. No, there is no CEDRE without the Syrian refugees. This was the major driver for this conference. And one of the reasons why I don't think that CEDRE has any success of being implemented, because we haven't won a policy towards Syrian refugees. There is no consensus on that. So how we will address, and this will clash at one point or another. So unless we speak in one voice regarding the Syrian refugee thing, there is no chance to keep a sustainable relationship with the donors. Okay. When it comes to the value creation, yes, I totally agree with you. Just to give you a figure that for the last 4 years, our accumulated deficit was 20 billion, while our GDP raised by 4 billion. So meaning we're destroying wealth. We're not creating wealth. So yes, but who will do it? I mean, I don't want to steal the ideas of Chaaban, but he has a great theory about it. Where the buck stops, where is the authority? It's not in the cabinet. It's not inside the government. So yes, we can put pressure on the MPs, on the ministers, but the buck stops somewhere else.
But I really enjoyed listening to this panel. Very interesting, especially on the developmental issues and reform issues. Now, as far as interest rates are concerned, I would like us to put things in perspective, really. I would so much like us to do so. Again, in economics, things have to be measured in relative terms. And as far as interest rates, the higher the risk perception, the higher the interest rate. And the lower the ranking, the higher the interest rate. Now, if you were to compare Lebanon, which is a B minus ranking, to any other country you would like that has a B minus, you would find our interest rates much lower, sometimes more than 5-6% lower, on average 4 to 5% lower. So rates, when it comes to that, are not too high compared to other B minus. If you were to compare our rates to triple B, of course, you would see triple B are lower, but lower by only 0.5, Alia knows better, 0.7. It's not a solution to things, of course, but for us not to easily, if you wish, make statements. I'm not accusing any of the panel, I'm speaking of the mood. Then when we speak of very high interest rates in the banking system, well, interest rates in the banking system, first of all, interest rates have increased all over the world, from the developed to the emerging markets. But interest rates on loans in dollars are of 10.4%. And Banque de Liban in general is today into a policy of subsidizing more or less, as far as interest payment, half of this 10.4. So we're speaking of 5. I don't want to go and venture and speak of real interest rates. When interest rates are at 10 and inflation is at 6, real interest rates are not as high as one might have dreaded. This public debt and crowding out. No, let me keep it aside for the moment. I won't be long, Jad, promise. But this idea of why do we borrow, and what need is it for us to borrow from the CEDRE, and do we want to increase our debt exposure? Let me remind us that CEDRE is promising loans at 1%, and we speak in $15 billion or so dollars. So this 1% plus the average interest payment on debt, which is 7%, if you put them together, instead of us suffering from a 7% average cost of debt, we will be speaking of 5-point-something average cost of debt. And if we grow at 5%, then it is more of a possibility of going back to this debt ratio in a positive way. Of course, we can borrow. In Lebanon, we have ample of funds of $220 billion. As if we were, as a government, to borrow from those $220 billion, we would borrow at 7%. We are given the opportunity to borrowing at 1%. So I'm not at ease with this idea of putting all things in the same box.
And since the last only English speaking has left, maybe more an hour ago, I'll speak in Arabic again. نحن صرنا حضرنا 3 panels. conclusion بدنا نفهم بالآخر. إذا بمشي مع دكتور سامي شو قال، إنه يا خيي أو حتى شوي الدكتور يوسف انه في عنا 11 مليار فينا ناخذهم ب 1%، خلينا ناخذهم. وايه وفينا بس انه محل ما انه هيدا اخر تشانس وخلينا نظبطه وكذا. اذا بسمع شوي يعني بقيه البانلست عم بيقولوا انه هاي تتخلي النظام ومش ظابطه وما بتعمل ديفلوبمنت، مش هيدا الفيو. انا حقيقه بس اذا حدا يعطينا كونكلوجن تنظهر بعد يعني 5 ساعات شوي. انا يعني بدي اقول شغله انه مزبوط الافريج انترست بينزل، بس الاماونت ما عم نعمل سوابينج اوف لون، عم بيكبر حجم القروض وبالتالي الانترست عم ندفعها ان ريل ان ابسولوت تيرمز بده يكون اكبر كاماونت. بس بغض يعني بغض النظر انه عم نكبر الحجم تبع الانترست، لو يعني 1% كثير، يعني الكونكلوجن نحن عم نقولها انه 11 بليون ات 1% حلوه، يمكن بتظبطنا شوي الانفراستراكشر، تعملنا حقنه لسنتين نعيش. هل هيدي منيحه او لازم كلنا ناخذ قرار هلا نطلع بورقه ريكومنديشن انه نحن ضد صدر؟ انا برفع ايدي لهالشيء.
ديانا من عام. اول شيء بوافق طبعا على التو بخصوص الايكونوميك موديل تبعولنا، يعني I agree that it is fully unsustainable and that CEDRE is but a lifeline to this weak model. So we're in agreement على هيدا الشيء. من بعد 3 ل 4 سنين بنعرف انه this is the way to go. Let us try to build our productive sectors. هيدا اذا لقينا حدا اصلا يسمع لنا ويامن انه we should build our productive sectors instead of building roads and buildings only. بس السؤال هو هالسنتين، يعني we all know that these 2 years are critical. من شو مبين بموازنة عم يوعدونا انه لازم تطلع من هلأ لشهر بالبرلمان، بعد ما في ولا حديث عن شو رح ينعمل لنخفض العجز ومن وين رح نخفض العجز. والثلاث اماكن الاساسيه يلي فينا يلي المفروض نشتغل عليها، يلي هي الكهرباء ويلي هي الويجز اند سالاريز ويلي هي الدين، خدمه الدين، واضح انه ما حدا بده يقرب عليهم. يعني الكهرباء ان شاء الله ينعمل شيء، بس حتى اذا انعمل شيء الريبركشنز تبعولها او النتائج والبنفيتس اللي رح نبلش نشوفها منا قبل سنه ونص سنتين على القليله. فالسؤال هو من هلا لسنتين شو لازم نعمل؟ يعني في ريتنج ايجنسيز جايين باوغست عم يحكوا العالم وخايفين من داون جريد بعد ثانيه. حدا عم بفكر بهذا الموضوع؟ شو في contingency plan؟
Okay, thank you.
Maybe one quick clarification and one quick comment regarding CEDRE and Syrian refugees. There might be some confusion. I think maybe the motivation for the conference might have been the Syrian refugee issue, of course, and other political and geopolitical issues, naturally. But in terms of dispensing the loans, they're not at all tied to that. The one that might be on your minds is the projects related to GCFF, where there needs to be both beneficiaries for the refugees and for the host community. But for the CEDRE, there's actually no centralized mechanism for the lending to be dispensed. Each multinational organization, multilateral organization will dispense according its own procurement and its own financial procedures. Now, on CEDRE and McKinsey and the such, I think what would help is we can maybe minimize what they are, because if we get into this, I think, idea that they are the solutions, the unique solutions, the answers, the visions, then of course there are a lot of issues with them, including not dealing with the balance of payments issues, including with not dealing with basic macroeconomic imbalances. So putting it in perspective is very important. It is a solution in the sense that infrastructure is a problem for the country. Infrastructure is a main bottleneck for growth. This is verified across all indicators. You need better infrastructure. Of this infrastructure, electricity, first and foremost, needs to be front-loaded. That will affect the economy across, from small businesses to large industries. CEDRE offers concessionary finance. I agree with Dr. Nader. It's best to take the reforms,
to fix electricity on your own without that's the best case scenario. Worst case scenario is you take the loans without reforms. I think very well said.
In the cocktail, yes.
When I was talking about the effect of public policy, essentially fiscal policy, on the issue of interest rates, it's because we have a huge deficit that we keep. It adds to the debt, and we need to attract this money. Has to come from outside, and then for it to come, they don't come because we have blue, because we have brown eyes. It's because we pay a premium that also relates to our creditworthiness or lack thereof. We lack about the unconvincing fiscal policy that we are discussing, and so there is essentially the fundamental thing, and also this is an answer to Diana, is what can we do in the immediate term? In the immediate term, we have to reduce the budget deficit. To reduce the budget deficit, there's expenditure and there's the revenue. With regard to the expenditure, yesterday we can cut $1.5 billion from the electricity deficit. We don't need, if the Électricité du Liban, the non-Électricité du Liban, has not been able to give us electricity in 30 years. Why don't we give it to somebody in the private sector to build a generator and to give us the 2,000 or 3,000 megawatt that we need on the one hand. And then it's going to have a virtuous effect if we reduce the deficit, and also the creditworthiness may improve, the need for borrowing may use. On the revenue side also, now, nobody should, hesitated, because I'm not advocating at all an increase in the revenue, an increase in taxes. But to a certain extent, if it were not a dysfunctional, I'm not going to say a failed state, and providing the services, there is considerable room still with regard to revenue. Public revenue is around 20% of GDP. In developed countries, 40-50% of GDP. But we cannot raise money for it to be stolen or not to provide the services on the one hand. And the other thing, there's a need for a fiscal reform, because the fiscal system we have is regressive and unfair. Around 25% of our revenue are direct revenue, and 75% are indirect, which are regressive. So a lot of things can be done.
Thank you. هختم بس سريعا بالعربي بس قبل ما ننقل لاخر شيء. بعتقد خلاصه الاساسيه لهذا النقاش ولكل النقاشات انه في حاجه لحوار. ما بقى فينا نعمل سياسات عامه ونربطها باسامي سادر. وانا معك، بالعكس كلنا بدنا قروض ارخص واحسن، بس القروض بغياب سياسات اقتصاديه اجتماعيه ما بتفيد لشيء. في ضروره مثل ما عمل كريم اليوم وغير الحوارات، لازم بمجلس الاقتصاد الاجتماعي بالمؤسسات الدولية نعمل حوار مضبوط اقتصادي. وين بدنا نستثمر؟ على شو بدنا نستثمر؟ شو أولويات الإصلاح؟ وعلى أساسها بنقدم للقروض. هذا بعتقد الخلاصة اللي نحكى اليوم، إنه ضروري الحكومة اللي ما يبقى فيه معارضة موالات وهيك، ضروري ما زلنا في خطر داهم يفتحوا مجال الحوار مع كل الناس. في خبراء هون، في خبراء غيرهم، بس ينعمل كيف يعملوا ريفرندوم على القضايا الوطنية، ينعمل ريفرندوم على الأولويات الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، وعلى أساسها بيتقدم لسادر. سادر منه قانون ما حدا مضي عليه، ومنه ماكنزي كمان مش قانون. هولي إسهامات مهمة، لايف لاين كتير مهمة. أنا مش ضد الاستدانة، بس يكون في عنا على القليل لشي مرة خطة موافقين عليها المواطنين وأغلبية الأحزاب. للعلم إنه المجلس الاقتصادي والاجتماعي عملوا أولويات إصلاحية على أساس اتفقوا عليها الأحزاب، بس apparently كمان ما عم بيمشوا فيها. بقى أنا بتمنى ينعمل حوارات أكتر، وبحب مرة تانية أتشكر البانيلست والمحضرين، وبنختم مع كلمة المنظمة حضرتك. شكرا لكم.